Good morning, everyone. We're going to just wait a few moments. There are a lot of people still um, logging on. My name is Karen Carter, and we will be talking about decentralized clinical trials today. So, like I said, we're just going to give it a few more minutes as I see they're still logging in and connecting. Okay, again, my name is Karen Carter. I work with the Center for Clinical and Translational Science. We are a department at the Ohio State University College of Medicine that can assist you with your research questions. If you have any, please feel free to reach out to us as we have multiple resources available to both the clinical research professional as well as the investigator. Today, we are going to be talking about the decentralized clinical trials. This is something that has been coming for a while. I believe it was a little slow, but I think that we've all been immersed in decentralized clinical trials a little more with the onset of COVID. So again, today we're going to be talking about decentralized clinical trials. So today's objectives will be to define a decentralized clinical trial, to have a better understanding of what it is and what it is not. We're going to discuss 6 key concepts that you need to be considering when planning a decentralized clinical trial. And then I have 2 clinical trials that I actually worked on that can demonstrate how some of these protocols were decentralized during the course of the study. So the definition by FDA standards of a decentralized clinical trial are clinical trials that are conducted remotely through either telemedicine, local health providers, or technologies that are different than the traditional site-based studies. They provide more convenience to the study subjects, and they can also reduce your overall expenses in the budget for reimbursing participants for travel and other expenses. Decentralized clinical trials are sometimes referred to as remote trials. Uh, One of our famous acronyms is the DCT. So you'll see that in the literature. But one of the things you want to think about with decentralized clinical trials is that every single one of them will be different. Just like our clinical trials, no one protocol is the same. But a decentralized clinical trial does have inherent some differences that you really want to consider prior to initiating your recruitment process. So, when you're considering a decentralized clinical study design, some of the things that you need to think about are that it doesn't mean that you have to be totally remote in everything that you do. Most often, a decentralized clinical trial is one that is considered a hybrid, where part of the study is conducted on site, part of the study is conducted at the patient's home or at a local physician's office. But these are things where the research team is now starting to come to the patient's local address or area and bringing the clinical study care to them. So the first thing you want to do when doing a decentralized clinical trial is to consider what processes and procedures you wish to accomplish and which ones can be done at the home of the individual or ones that really need to be conducted at the hospital or the study site. These are things such as x-rays or biopsies, MRIs, special research only type procedures. There are studies where there are certain protocols for an x-ray. They want this angle or they want that angle. One of the issues with doing that, obviously, is also making sure that you have a general reader. I know that there are many studies where if you've had some type of radiological exam, you end up sending it to a repository or certain investigators who are approved to look at them and assess them. This is also very oftentimes used with your MRIs or cardiac function tests, where a individual, so that you do not have such variabilities in the assessments. You also want to identify those procedures that can be performed easily by general healthcare staffing. So if is it a blood draw, is that something that you can get a local healthcare nurse to go to the home and get those blood draws for the subjects? If it's getting vital signs, a lot of times the follow-up visits can be conducted remotely or as at the subject's convenience. So these are things that you really want to map out, and you want to map it out prior to submitting protocols for to the IRB. Some other things to consider are making sure that you maybe look at other studies that have been conducted, decentralized clinical trials, see how they set things up. What kind of safety mechanisms did they include into their study? Consider the use of mobile technologies. As I discussed last week, there are a lot of options available to collecting data at the site, as opposed to making the subjects come into a research study site and having that information collected, such as the telemedicine. You can ask the questions via telemedicine just as easily as you can if they come into the research center. Develop extensive training documents to ensure the consistency of the data collection techniques. This is probably one of the, in my opinion, one of the key elements, is that in order to reduce your variabilities of how something is done, you want to make sure that you have those training documents. If they are written, you can also use videos to demonstrate how something is to be done, but make sure that it is very clear. And if this is training documents or education for the subject, make sure that you don't use a lot of medical jargon that they won't understand. Centralize your document management. You really need to be looking at the fact that you no longer are in control of each and everything that goes on. Instead of everybody coming to you, it's being dispersed out amongst, the state or states, plural. And so making sure that you have things ironed down as far as making sure that you have that contact and you have that management so that you can pinpoint errors or problems right from the get-go. Documenting, centralizing the paperwork is going to help you keep track of, versions, who has signed what consent version, and things like that. So it's very important that there be a central place for all of these documents. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but if you are using some of the local healthcare providers, you also need to be keeping track of all of their licensure and their approvals and so forth, in a centralized location. You want to include technology management and the continued technology management in the planning process. Oftentimes in the past, I've seen clinical or decentralized clinical trials start up. They have a lot of technology involved with telemedicine and all, but yet in their budget, they do not include a line item for technical support. And it is important that you consider that if you're going to be using medical devices that might need triaging or troubleshooting down the road. And then probably one of the most important things at this point is to look at the telemedicine state laws that are currently in place. Every state does not have the same telemedicine laws. There are a lot of states that are coming closer together to having very similar laws, but there are different laws in the different states. So if you are going to be recruiting across state lines, it's very important that you know what those are. It's also important to know what those laws are and those parameters are for in your state, because they can vary with time, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So one of the things that I alluded to in documentation is how are you going to ensure the reliability, integrity, and the traceability of your research data? You want to really map it out ahead of time to make sure that you have a good flow of information, that you're documenting who has access to what. Again, imagine that now instead of just all concentrated in one spot, all of the personnel are scattered all over the place. So you want to make sure that you really have a good control, and that's with your documentation of where things are going and how things are supposed to go. Because you are going to be going over spreading out, you want to ensure that your HIPAA security and protections are in place, that you know who has access to what type of data. This is especially important when you have data transfers. Who has the right to complete those data transfers? Where is the data going to be stored? Is it only going to be stored at the study site? Is there a sponsor involved that part of this information is going to be stored at their site? Is it going to be saved at local pediatricians' offices? Excuse me, I worked on pediatric trials. It's going to be saved at the local physician's office. Is it within the medical technology that is going to a cloud for you to then reach out and take from the cloud? So these are all questions that you want to start asking ahead of time before you run into those issues. And then again, for your traceability, you want to be able to have systems where you can look at it and you can say, oh, this person transferred this data on this date. This person did this on that date. And so that is where you really need to verify the accuracy of your data collection processes and pathways and flows. This is probably for the research study, one of the most important things, because that is your data. Protect the subject and secure the data. That's how I look at clinical trials. So, issues with using local healthcare professionals. So these would be your home healthcare nurses, use of mini clinics, using personnel in a local primary's office, or perhaps you just send them into an ambulatory office that they're going to have certain procedures done. I know several of the um, primary cares have merged together here, at least within uh, Columbus, Ohio, where you go to a certain facility for your x-rays and things like that, and then that's sent to the primary care physicians. So you want to be considering how you're going to make sure that the data is concise and that everybody is collecting it in the same way. An example might be a study that I was part of where we wanted to do a blood pressure. The protocol specified that you wanted to wait once the subject had arrived at the clinical site um, for them to wait 15 minutes before you took the blood pressure. And that was so that if they had been walking, things like that, that they were at a resting state for the blood pressure. And so waiting the 15 minutes was how the protocol stated that. again, if you're using a home health care nurse that goes out to the subject's home, you would want to make sure that that individual, that healthcare nurse, is also waiting 15 minutes, having the patient sit in a chair, wait 15 minutes, and then take the blood pressure so that you get similar type readings, so that you're kind of comparing apples to apples, but you want to make sure that you're going even further and making sure that you're comparing gala apples to gala apples and not red delicious. Again, very small nuances, but with your data, it's very important that you do it in the exact same procedure. Um, Make sure that all of the personnel involved within the clinical trial truly understand the difference between research procedures and standard of care. It's an understanding that not all understand, even our PI sometimes. And that is that with research, you're looking at everyone. Standard of care, it's just that one person. And how important it is that you actually follow line by line a protocol as opposed to just kind of winging it, that if I put the if I wait 10 minutes as opposed to 15 minutes, I'm taking the blood pressure. That is an important detail. In standard of care, that wouldn't necessarily be an issue. If it was extremely high, you would wait a few minutes and you'd take it again. For research protocols, that's not something that you would want to do. If it was extremely high, you would record it, but then you might also repeat it a little bit later on just to make sure that the patient was safe. Maintaining your delegation of authority logs, your training logs, and your credential logs. Again, you're using home health care individuals that may be in another state. They may be subject to different licensing laws. You want to make sure that they have the proper credentials to perform the procedures and processes that you're asking them to perform. Um, there are stipulations sometimes between, we had a study that said that the person consenting, the subject, had to be the investigator and it could not be a nurse practitioner. Now, in a lot of areas, nurse practitioners would be allowed to do some of those procedures that an investigator or a physician might be able to do, but for this particular protocol, it was not allowed. So you really need to make sure that you have those credentials. And because of the nature of your home healthcare units, a lot of times you have a lot of turnover. So the home health care nurse that went out 3 months ago may no longer be with that company. And so now you've got someone new. So you really need to keep a track of who is doing what on your studies. And this is sometimes a little harder to hold on to when designing your clinical trials. You train a series of 10 home health care nurses to go out, get vitals, draw blood, do certain procedures. Well, 6 months into the study, those 10, you have 5 left, but now you've also got 5 more. So these are things that you really want to be considering and documenting. And I'll discuss that when we discuss some of the clinical trials that I've participated in as to how not doing that came back to cause problems. Sometimes you might also consider using the subject's primary care physician or their PCP for doing certain things. In other words, if you have a subject that they might be able to go in to their local doctor to have certain procedures done, if there was an infusion involved, that they would go there. So these are things to consider. But again, if you're doing something like that, you want to make sure that you're documenting if that physician is going to be performing a procedure that has some assessment to it. You want to make sure that they are included on your training logs, and you might also need to be thinking about the 1572. Create extremely detailed source data reports. And by that, I mean, as those healthcare workers are in the field collecting your data, yes, if they have the ability to put that data straight into an iPad that sends it to the cloud, that's great. But even there, you want to make sure that you've specified, using the example of the blood pressure, that in that verbiage that you have that little instruction in there saying, did you wait 15 minutes before performing the blood pressure? And they check yes. And that they say what time they took it. Those are the things that you want to be able to document. Maybe that's not one of your central data points, but it is going to be important when compliance checks are done to make sure, did everybody wait those 15 minutes before taking the blood pressure as instructed. So again, these are little details that can make a big difference down the road. Another thing that you might be able to do is consider you developing some standard operating procedures for those that are out in the field, those remote healthcare workers, to follow, so that you keep everyone doing things the exact same way. One of the things that you also need to consider is if samples are being collected, blood samples or whatever, that have those individuals had their category B shipping information or ADA training, so that you can make sure that they have the proper authority to ship your biological samples, and that they have that training, that it's current, and that they have a full understanding of what is involved, um, and how they're going to do it. Oops, sorry, wait a minute. Okay, so another thing that you're going to have to be thinking about is the delegation of and accountability of the PI or the investigator. So that is often a very large topic of conversation of the investigator's oversight of a clinical trial. They are the ultimate individual responsible for everything that goes on. Now, they're not only trying to oversee research staff at their site where they are located, but they're also now responsible for oversight of individuals that may be scattered across state lines. How are you going to accomplish that? Um, as I alluded to earlier, if you are using primary care physicians, it's discussions with them as to how things are going. And you want to make sure that you're somehow documenting that oversight. What has the PI done to demonstrate oversight of what is going on? Is it that there's a monthly report out where the physician is to review, here are the different sites, or here are the patients, here are the things that are ongoing, kind of like a running log of updates, so that they can be sure that they know what is going on. And it's, again, very important. The literature really stressed that the protocols really need to define the differences involved in doing standard of care versus research, because there are small nuances in the way that you approach it. And again, make sure that you have some type of documentation, even when conducting clinical trials, all at a local site. In other words, a non-decentralized trial. You want to be able to document the PI's oversight, so that if there's ever a question involved of, did they know, that you can show, yes, they were made aware and this is what they did. That's why we have them sign off on all of the labs. This is part of their oversight. This is part of their knowing what is going on in their clinical trial, and that they know what is going on with their patients and their study populations. Oh, one other thing. Again, if you're using some of those more local or remote healthcare professionals, you do need to be thinking about whether or not they also need to be included on the 1572 as being individuals who are responsible for some of the research assessments, however that is handled. So it can get a little tricky in making sure that you have on there those individuals. And again, it may change as personnel change across the width of your study. It may change, and so you may have to do revisions. And that's where having that centralized personnel to manage all these documents, they're the ones then making sure that these revisions are made in a timely manner and that they are reporting what is actually going on and well documented. So again, centralized documentation so that someone is watching whatever is going on. Kind of like a dashboard where you can kind of watch and see all the things that are happening in your study. So safety monitoring. Just because they're all scattered all over half the country doesn't mean that safety monitoring is not in effect. So again, you want to make sure that you have a detailed process written down so that there are no assumptions. You want to be ready for any type of issue. So you want to kind of look far ahead as to what might happen. You might want to have a listing of local facilities. If you have a subject, what are some of the local facilities that you might be able to refer them to if they needed some type of immediate medical attention? Have it written out ahead of time. Don't be waiting until it happens and they go, oh, we need to find someone they can go see. So have some of those things planned out ahead of time. There are ways for you to try to anticipate some of the more realistic events that may possibly occur, depending on what type of medical product you're using. So develop escalation plans. This is something that we did for one of the studies because the subjects were, due to the nature of the study, might have an increase in self-harm. So we had an escalation plan that what if they expressed some of this? How did we make sure that they, if it was immediate, that they got help before they left the research site? If using mobile devices, this is where making sure that you have technologists available to you to problem solve some of the issues that might arise. Subject calls in and says, it's not working anymore. So you have step-by-step procedures. Check. If it's battery operated, did the battery die? Can we replace the battery? And don't assume that those subjects will inherently know how to problem solve or troubleshoot those medical devices. Many don't have those technology. So you want to make sure that you have methods written down somewhere that you can then say, okay, well, that can happen. So let us first check to make sure that we have a good battery. Much like, make sure it's plugged in. Did you recharge it like you were supposed to? Maybe it needs recharged. Maybe the contact that they have is no longer valid. Or in questioning them, you found out that they wore it in the shower when they were supposed to take it off before getting in the shower. So you might need to send them out a replacement. So these are, again, processes and procedures that you need to be able to anticipate. And that's what makes decentralized clinical trials a little more difficult because you are having to anticipate these type of issues and have information and individuals available to troubleshoot. Another thing is making sure that you're reviewing the incoming data in a timely fashion. If you wait in 6 months in and say, okay, let's make sure that everything's coming, and then you look and it says, well, it stopped transmitting 3 months ago, that's going to be a big issue. So you want to have scheduled checks to make sure that if the information is or data is supposed to be flowing in to a certain cloud or something like that, that someone is checking to make sure that everything is running the same way. Much like a manufacturing facility, there's someone who is checking to make sure that everything is continuing to proceed as anticipated and not waiting 2 months in to find out that this particular machine is not working. Um, Again, for the sub training of your participants, make sure you have very clear and simple instructions for them to follow. Include when you're doing the training, something that is written out that they can follow if they have questions. Training videos. I know that on one clinical trial that the sponsor gave us a video on how to perform a certain function with the blood tests processing that we needed to do. And the video was so helpful in demonstrating what they meant. We were looking at RNA and we had to add certain materials to get a pellet. Well, to me, a pellet is more like a pill, and this was a little bit of residue at the bottom of the tube. So again, the videos really do help demonstrate what it is that you want those subjects to do. And it's also something they can refer back to should they have questions further into the study. And if you are needing safety labs because of the investigational side of the study med that you're using, you want to make sure that someone is monitoring that those safety labs are being conducted. One of the issues that we had with pediatric trials often was that sometimes at a given day, we were not able to get the required volume of blood that we needed from that pediatric patient. So we had to, prior to their visits, prioritize what blood samples we needed to collect first. And those were typically those that were safety measures or direct data endpoints. So again, make sure that those things are being done so that if questioned, have there been any adverse safety labs, that you are checking that. And if there is an abnormal one, that you do have procedures in place as to what you're going to do. If their level was out of range, was that an issue of the home health nurse that was taking it? Or was that a true reading? So if you had an abnormal reading, you might want to put something into the protocol saying that it would be checked again to make sure that that was accurate if it was way out. So again, every single trial is different. How you handle it is going to be different. There really needs to be a lot of planning and considerations prior to starting these trials. Yes, they are easier on the subjects, but it's a lot harder on the research staff because, again, rather than having everything right there in the research arena, very well controlled, it's now being scattered. Oh, we're going to advance. Oh, okay, so state laws on telemedicine. Just as there's different licensing stipulations from state to state, telemedicine also has differences state to state. Remember that telemedicine is a relatively new process that prior to COVID, it was being rolled out very slowly. So that's where, you know, it was there, but a lot of the research audiences were very reluctant because, again, it takes a lot of control out of their hands. How do you document it and things like that? with COVID, obviously, a lot of these things were then put on, as the FDA would call it, a fast track. We got to get it done as of yesterday. So there was a very rapid deployment of telemedicine procedures, and this also then created a lot of variability in the state laws. So at the end of this, I will have some references for you to use to check those state laws, so that if you were going to be recruiting across state lines, um, that you have something to refer to. And there's actually an agency that stays up to date on these things as they change. As and if Again, a lot of the states are trying to become more uniform and have the same approach to telemedicine. Um, One of the issues with telemedicine is the documentation of what occurred, who was there, and things like that. Very important if you're using telemedicine for standard of care, especially if you're looking for insurance or Medicare, Medicaid reimbursements. So again, it's very important ahead of implementing protocols to make sure that you know what those state laws are. So some of the variability, it was really surprising when I was reading through some of this, is that some states will require that there is a licensed physician within that state. Um, Oops, that's just advancing by itself today. Okay, so that there be a licensed physician within the state, um, not just the licensed physician at the study site giving information to home health nursing staff, that there has to also be a licensed physician within that state in order to perform the telemedicine. The medical licenses also vary from state to state for both the physicians and support staff, nursing, and etc. Some require that before the participant can participate in telemedicine or have telemedicine, not sure which verb that is, um, that the physician, the investigator, and the participant have to meet in person for the very first time, establishing that relationship before they can move to a telemedicine relationship. So two of the centers that I talked about, the Center for Connected Health Policy, and there's links later on, and the Interstate Medical Licensure Compact are two resources that if you are going to be entering into a decentralized trial, you may want to reference. The Center for Connected Health Policy talks a lot about the changes to the laws around telemedicine. Interstate Medical Licensure Compact is a way that your physician can sometimes easily get licensing in other states in order to conduct the telemedicine. So again, depending on how wide your recruitment area is, multi-state, and things like that, are some resources that you may want to reference before you proceed. Okay, and then you have your investigational product accountability. So obviously you're talking about a clinical trial. So more than likely there is a device or drug involved. Um, how are you going to be accountable for that medical product? Um, Again, nothing is consistent. The state laws vary as to how you can handle all of this information. Um, One, it will depend on the status of the product. Has the FDA approved it, or is it still in its investigational phase? Um, Oftentimes, you may not be able to send the study drug directly to the subject. So you may have to send it to their local pediatric or local primary care physician, or to an agency that then takes it out to the subject because of the dispensing law. It has to be dispensed by a medical care personnel. It can't be in a shipment, depending on the type of investigational product that it is. The stability of the medical product. Is it something that is ready to use, or is the subject going to have to maybe mix something, uh, add water to it, reconstitute it? Well, how are you going to guarantee that they add the correct amount of water? Is it sterilized water, and so forth? Um, Temperature monitoring at the clinical sites. If you have a research pharmacy, they hold on to all of the study meds. They ensure that the temperature of where they're stored is consistent with the protocol. So how is it going to be handled? How are you going to do your compliance checks and accountability checks if they're not coming into the site? Um, Obviously, you would probably want to put something in the protocol that at some point they return to the site for some type of accountability. But again, how do you perform those monthly checks to make sure that they're taking the medication the way that they're supposed to? Uh, if they've missed um, daily doses or whatever it is, um, and they have leftover drug, what do they do with it? Do they return it to the site? Do they return it to the primary care physician? How is that going to be handled? And then you have the instances where it is not as simple, here, take this pill, or reconstitute this powder and, do that. It's an injectable or it's an infusion. And one of the examples we'll talk about was an infusion, a weekly infusion. How was that worked? So these are, again, questions that need to be asked ahead of time so that you can figure out what those answers are before they're posed to you. So, two study examples. So, the first study was Teen Labs. This is a study, the PI is Dr. Inge out of Cincinnati. And what the study was is to look at adolescents who underwent bariatric surgery for obesity. When it first started, it was just going to be a 2-year study where populations were recruited, where they would get a load of baseline data, and then we would collect data right after the surgery and at certain time points over 2 years to see how they did. And they were looking at not just weight numbers, but also looking at attitude towards food, taking a lot of baseline information. Well, because it was so important, and because then we had a cohort of adolescents going through early life development, it's continued, and it's still continuing today. And I think it's now in its 15th year, somewhere around there. But the problem is that when they enrolled in the study, they were adolescents in school, and it was very easy, well, somewhat easy, to get them to come into a follow-up visit at the research site. It became a little more hard when all of a sudden they've graduated school and they've gone off to college. So how do we collect this information? So we went to a procedure where a lot of it was complete the questionnaires and send them back, and tracking them and doing things like that. But even then, how did we collect the data samples? So we would take blood samples and run certain blood tests. And we would do certain measurements, very detailed measurements. It wasn't just their weight and height. We were also doing measurements around their neck, around their waist. And these were all blood pressures. We would take 3 and, average them, type of thing. So how did we do that if they were no longer able to come into the research site? And by this point, we had gone to a yearly. It was once a year we would collect this data. So again, we contracted with the mini clinics that were starting up at that time at the various like Kroger's and things like that. But we contacted with them that the individuals could go to a mini clinic and have those vitals taken. We reduced the number of data points to make it easier. Um, but again, what we were finding is that not the personnel at those sites were not always very consistent in following the research protocol. It would be a guesstimate, or they didn't follow the procedure of taking the blood and doing certain things. So we had inconsistencies there. We also tried using home health care nurses that would travel out to the homes with a special way to measure and things like that. But again, we were having a lot of variability. So we went back into really trying to get them to come into the clinical site in order to do this, so we didn't have the variability involved, and asking the questions. And I'm sure that it's still a very difficult situation as you have young people who are young in the workforce, first jobs. Uh, they can't afford to take a whole day off of work, because it would almost take some of them a whole day by the time they would travel into the research site and have that done and then go back home. Another study that I was involved on the periphery of was a gene therapy study. It was a pediatric study. And this was looking at the Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. And we had come up, Dr. Jerry Mendel had developed a gene skipping, don't ask me to explain it all, but a gene skipping investigational product that would prolong, keep the young boys out of the wheelchairs. So in other words, it kind of boosts the muscle development. One of the things with Duchenne's is that the process for renewing muscle tissue has an error in it. So this was a way of introducing into the system a protein or gene skipping that then would help to renew those or those muscle tissues. So we started the study as a phase 1 with a cohort of about 20 boys, and this required for them to come in and have a weekly injection. So we did the first phase 1. It seemed safe and effective. We moved into the phase 2, which was a 2-year trial, where these young boys and their families had to come into the study site every single week to have this infusion done. At the end of the study, they were able to prove to the FDA that it was effective, it was safe, and it was given as approved, but they still wanted the phase 3 follow-up to watch for long-term effects. This was something you were giving to young boys that are in their developmental stages of pediatrics, and they wanted to watch the safety overall profile of the medication. So are we still, for the next 3 or 4 years, going to be asking these families, as far as California, to come in on a weekly basis to have this infusion? Obviously, they decided not to. So again, they had to contract with home health care nurses that would go out and collect this, or provide the infusion and collect data and collect information. But it became very, very difficult using the home health care individuals to have consistency of the visits. There was too much variability. They got this time. They didn't get this time. It was too difficult. When dealing with individuals with some type of muscular dystrophy, doing blood draws can be very difficult, because as you're doing the stick, the skin does not have your normal flexibilities and things like that that you would anticipate. And it often takes very skilled nurses that are used to doing this type of injections to be able to do these things. So again, there was a lot of issues involved in doing these types of things. So not all studies will do well as decentralized trials. Obviously, you wouldn't want to do a phase 1 or a phase 2 study as a decentralized trial. You may be able to use certain aspects of a decentralized trial if they were not receiving weekly injections, but had received an injection and now you're doing follow-ups. Yeah, you could do that part decentralized to follow them over a course of time, but you would not want to be having all sorts of different individuals collecting some of this data. That is very important that it be collected the same way each and every time, or that you have those that are watching injection sites for some type of issue. We used to, for these young men, they would take photos each time of the injection site at the beginning and at the end, just to make sure that there was no reaction. And if there was a reaction, they would really watch it to see what it did. So, and those are things that those that are not involved in their lives on a daily basis would not think to do. The nurses that worked with these young men became very, very close to the families. And when the young boys do return to Nationwide Children's for other follow-up, they will often stop in the clinical research study site or center there to see those nurses again because of the closeness that they developed seeing these nurses every week for over a 2 or 3 year period. So decentralized clinical trials, a very good concept for those patients, but at the same time, not all of them will be subject to decentralized clinical trial. And if you do want to move into that, because it does help with recruitment, it does help you reaching patients in numbers that you wouldn't before, has a lot of pros to it. But again, being able to control the trial is probably one of the biggest issues of how are you going to manage all of this information and make sure that it's reliable, that it's valid, that it's been collected in the same manner so that you can compare your Gala apples to your Gala apples and be able to produce a good quality study. It takes a lot of management, a lot of pre-thought, a lot of looking at state laws once you start crossing state lines. And if you're talking about an international trial, good luck. It would probably be even harder in order to do some of those things, because now you're talking about international laws, you're talking about exporting medical products, and it would be very, very difficult. So again, decentralized clinical trials are a tool that clinical investigative teams can use when they're having difficulties recruiting or to make it easier on your subjects. But it is not always a fit for what it is that you're looking at and need. I did talk about having some references, and we will be sending these out this afternoon. Oops, come on. There we go. Oops. Well, that wasn't what I wanted. Those are the competencies if you're tracking your JTF competencies that this met. Well, it's just going to go to the end. Anyways, there are some resources there that you can look at. I took a lot of the information first cite is a paper that if you are going to be involved in clinical or decentralized clinical trials, you definitely want to pull that up. It had a lot of useful information. It is something that was developed by the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, or again, your acronym of CTTI, not CITI. And they're a group of individuals out of Duke who really look at the clinical research arena and how to improve it. There is the last update was in fall of 2019, the state telehealth laws and reimbursement policies. That there is a link to the most recent updates, and it goes through state by state as to what their telemedicine laws are and what have changed. It's a very good resource if you're going to be getting into clinic or decentralized clinical trials. And then the last resource is to the Interstate Medical Licensure Compact. Again, that was is a website where if you are going to be going across state lines of how to help your physician, your investigator, get those licensures that they may require in order to conduct the study. I am actually in, let me find it. In the chat, I'm putting a link to a short Qualtrics. It's a very short questionnaire. If you would like to fill it out, that would be great. It's just collecting some information. I am interested to know how many decentralized trials we created or were created during COVID. So this would be a trial that typically they always came into the site, and that during COVID you made arrangements to start using telemedicine or some type of workaround in order to keep the study up and going, or if you just had to close it down. So I'm interested in that information as to how OSU responded to those needs as far as their individual clinical trials. I know clinical trials were created, but what about the existing ones? How did they fare for COVID? And, you know, are you now looking, if there's another surge and we have another shutdown, are these things that you're going to need to be considering? There again, think of these things ahead of time prior to. So with that, Rachel, were there any specific questions? If you do have a specific question that you would like for me to address in the few minutes that we have left, please go ahead and put them in the chat and we can answer them. Otherwise, have a wonderful day. Enjoy the sunshine while we have it before the gloom of Ohio winters hits us. And again, if you have questions, if you have suggestions, please reach out to me. I am working on the agenda for 2021 and would be open to any and all suggestions. This is a resource for the clinical research professionals at OSU and Children's. So again, please send me your suggestions. With that, Rachel, do we have any questions? I don't think so. With that, have a great day, everyone.
Hey, Karen, this is Sohyun. Are you still there?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am
How
still
are you?
here. Hi, how are you?
Doing very well. I have a quick question for you.
Okay.
So decentralizing clinical trials are very interesting to me. And I was looking at what is a good way, compliant way to make an electronic trial file, like a subject file. Because in case if you do decentralized remote trial and you collected, for example, you make a checklist for the visits and things like that, and any documents you may generate electronically, what is a good way to comply? It's not FDA control the study? Do you have any
There are
references?
I would reach out to the research information team and I can send you the contact information. But I would say offhand, I know that Box is going away, but you want to be able to share all those documents in a cataloged fashion. Perhaps on the cloud, perhaps in Box, where you have a study subject. Box is secure, where you might have a different file folder for each subject that you could then put their documents into. If you have a checklist that you've performed, electronically with them, again, you can put that in there. So it's basically creating an electronic folder that you would normally leave on your computer, but putting it up into the box so that it is secured, kind of like putting it in a locked file cabinet, would be one way. So it would kind of depend on the documents, but I think most of the documents you would be able to put it into Box. I'm not that familiar with the Microsoft Teams yet, but I have a feeling that there may be some parameters there that may be useful. And then again, if it's FDA, an investigator may want to be looking at vendors who do teledocuments. I do know that if you need signatures on things, that using there's a DocuSign is a good way to work with those to get signed documents back from individuals if they have computer access. But that is one of those instances, if you're doing the remote trials, do they have access to a computer to provide this information to you?
Thank you. That's a helpful.
Is that helpful? So
Yes.
if you're trying to do something like that and need some insight as to what resources are available, let me know and I'll see what we can find. But Research Information Technology is a new group. Tim Huerta just recently formed it within the last year. And there's a lot there that can kind of help you work around some of these issues as to how to function that way. But again, reach out to us. There's quite a few of us in the CCTS that may have some ways for you to do some of these things. Okay. So
thank you very much.
Thanks for the question. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye.